I say enough. Enough of lavishing excessive profits on investors and payouts and buybacks when the American people are watching. The world is watching. U.S. oil companies made nearly $80 billion in profit last year. And this year, those profits are expected to continue to soar. This is the time, not the time to sit on record profits. It's time to step up for the good of your country, the good of the world, to invest in immediate production that we need to respond to Vladimir Putin, to provide some relief for your customers, not investors and executives. Look, I'm a capitalist. I have no problem with corporations turning a good profit. But companies have an obligation that goes beyond just their shareholders, to their customers, their communities, and their country. No American company should take advantage of a pandemic or of Vladimir Putin's actions to enrich themselves at the expense of American families. Investing those profits in production and innovation. That's what they should do. Invest in your customers. And it isn't just like, it's not the patriotic thing, it's good for your business as well. Right now, oil and gas industry is sitting on nearly 9,000 unused but approved permits for production on federal lands, or more than 1 million unused acres they have a right to pump on. Families can't afford to let companies sit on their hands. So, to help execute this first part of my plan, I'm calling for a use it or lose it policy. Congress should make companies pay fees on wells on federal leases they haven't used in years, and acres of public land they're hoarding without production. Companies that are already producing from these wells won't be affected, but those sitting on unused leases and idle wells will either have to start producing or pay the price for their inaction. Look, the action I'm calling for will make a real difference over time. But the truth is, it takes months, not days, for companies to increase production. That's why the next part of my plan is so important. Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply until production ramps up later this year. And it is by far the largest release of our national reserve in our history.
Now, there isn't much that a president can do to control gas prices, even though Republicans will have you believe that Joe Biden himself is personally changing the number on those Exxon signs. But the fact is that this president is doing everything humanly possible within his power to get those prices back down. His announcement today is proof of that. It is a sad state of affairs that Biden even needed to take this step, but the fact is that oil companies have proven that they are incapable of not being profit-grubbing, predatory pillagers. In just 2021 alone, 4 companies, Exxon, BP, Shell, and Chevron, profited $174 billion. This while Americans were contending with cripplingly high prices on everything. These oil companies saw that and realized they could chalk up their own high prices to the same factors, knowing all the while that they would be delivering a windfall to shareholders. This is the definition of corporate greed, and it came at a time when Americans were hurting most. That shouldn't go unresponded to. And if you needed further proof, beyond the numbers right there in black and white, just take a listen to some of these oil company executives who balked at the very idea of increasing supply because they didn't want to do anything that might infringe on their ability to rake in high profits.
But audio from several fossil fuel companies' calls with investors are in stark contrast to those public comments. Instead, companies pledged higher dividends and stock buybacks to investors as Americans were hit with soaring gas prices.
Our cash flow-driven return of capital framework uniquely prioritizes our shareholders as the first call on cash flow generation, not the drill bit.
That's Marathon Oil CEO on February 17th, when the national average for gas prices was around $3.52 per gallon. That same day, Pioneer Natural Resources told investors this.
We're not going to change our growth rate. We think it's important to return cash back to the shareholders.
The day before Russia invaded Ukraine, Diamondback Energy's CEO also told investors they won't risk profits by increasing supply.
No one wants to see that shareholder return program put at risk with volume growth.
After a decade of dismal financial returns, including the pandemic, Diamondback also told investors the profit windfall they're experiencing is the moment investors have been waiting for. And on the day Russia invaded Ukraine, Occidental Petroleum CEO put it bluntly.
We have no need and no intent to invest in production growth this year.
The absolute personification of greed. And so now, Biden's taken a few steps. First, he's proposed a use it or lose it policy that would push oil companies to actually produce oil with the resources they already have. The oil and gas industry is currently sitting on more than 9,000 approved but unused permits for production on federal lands. So while their mouthpieces in Congress and the Republican Party love to pretend that Biden somehow kneecapped the oil industry by temporarily pausing leases on federal lands, what they conveniently leave out is the fact that those oil companies have opted not to use the permits they already have. Second, Biden will release 1 million barrels of oil per day for 6 months from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, equaling roughly 180 million barrels of oil, the largest reserve release in U.S. history. The Department of Energy will then use revenues from the sale of Strategic Petroleum Reserve barrels to restock the reserve when prices are lower. Not to hoard profits, not to scratch shareholders' backs, not to get rich off the backs of American consumers, but to simply provide a necessary service and then resupply so that we're prepared for the next time. This is what it looks like when people are put first, as opposed to profit-grubbing corporate interests. I should note too, for any of the Biden detractors out there, that this is what it's like when a president gets as creative as possible to actually help American consumers when they need that help, and B, when a president serves people instead of moneyed interests. Because keep in mind, when Donald Trump was in office, he helped negotiate a deal between Russia and then Saudi Arabia in 2020 to slash 9.7 million barrels of oil a day, or 10% of the world's output, because oil prices were falling. That's right, the Republican deity helped coordinate a deal to help those poor oil companies who were struggling with collapsing prices. And what happened? The very next day, oil prices skyrocketed 24% for the best day on record as a result of that agreement. So even though presidents can generally do very little to impact the price of gas, they do have certain tools at their disposal. The difference is whether they're going to use those tools to help regular people or the corporations screwing those people over. And finally, with all of that said, I'd be a fool not to also take this opportunity to say that this is the problem with relying on fossil fuels. Until and unless we transition to renewable energy, we will continue to rely on petrostates and autocrats like Putin in Russia and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. We will continue to rely on predatory oil companies who have proven to us that when Americans were hurting most, they used that opportunity to line their pockets to the tune of billions of dollars. I am tired of rewarding the worst actors on the planet. The only people who don't see the benefit in transitioning to renewables are the ones currently funded by those very oil and gas companies who stand to lose the most. So if you're tired of high gas prices, instead of using it to attack the president, who again can't do much to control the price of gas, why don't you focus your energy on the people who are actually screwing you over, and recognize that a reliance on fossil fuels isn't a necessity, it is a choice, and we should exercise that choice to live in a world where our finances aren't dictated by the price of a gallon of gas. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.